Greetings. Today we're going to talk about the important concept of validity. Before we do that, however, you might take a look at this cartoon and see if you think the arguments the boss uses here are valid or not. If you've got that figured out, then we can go on. We're going to approach it from a slightly different angle than the one in the book. The reason for this is not, of course, that the textbook is wrong. The textbook is fine. It's just to give you a slightly different angle, a different set of examples, and hopefully that will aid in your comprehension. We can begin with this point. Every argument has premises and a conclusion. The premises are statements, and these of course can be true or false, and they are that from which the argument proceeds. The conclusion is also a statement. It can also be true or false, and it is that to which the argument proceeds. It is what is supposedly supported by the premises. The premises are offered as supporting reasons for the conclusion. I'm going to go through these 5 points fairly quickly, and then we'll come back and go through them one by one with examples to illustrate. First of all, an argument with a true conclusion may not be valid. The fact that the conclusion is true, or the fact that you agree with the conclusion, is not reason enough to think that you've got a valid argument on your hands. Second, an argument with true premises may not be valid. So looking at an argument, you can't say, oh, the premises are true, therefore it must be valid. Or, I agree with the premises, and therefore it must be valid. Third, an argument with true premises and a true conclusion may not be valid. It can still go wrong as far as validity, even if it has true premises and a true conclusion. Fourth, a valid argument does not have to have true premises. And fifth, a valid argument does not have to have a true conclusion. Now, if you look at those, you may come up with the idea that maybe validity doesn't have much to do with truth. Here's a hint. You're right. An argument with a true conclusion may not be valid. Let's see if we can come up with an example. Try this. If Obama is the president, then he received the most votes. That's the first premise. Second, Obama received the most votes. Therefore, Obama is the president. Now, is that valid? Short answer is no. That is not a valid argument. So what goes wrong with it? Sit down, think about it, try to figure it out. Let's go on to the second. An argument with true premises may not be valid. Consider this one. All bananas are fruits. Some fruits are oranges. Therefore, some bananas are oranges. Now, you may have no hesitation in saying that's not valid, but it's important to see why it's not valid. Again, what's wrong with it? That has true premises, but it is not a valid argument. Here's another. An argument with true premises and a true conclusion may not be valid. But try this one. The sun is bigger than the moon. The moon is smaller than the earth. Those are both true premises, right? Therefore, the earth is between the sun and the moon in size. That is not a valid argument. Again, there's an important question. Why not? What's wrong with it? Can you figure it out? fourth point. A valid argument does not have to have true premises. Try this one. Socrates is a fruit pie. Every fruit pie is a baked potato. Therefore, Socrates is a baked potato. Now, that is a valid argument. Fifth, a valid argument does not have to have a true conclusion. Of course, we could just use the same example as we used last time, but let's try another. Whoever was elected on November 4th is the 44th president. Dick Cheney was elected on November 4th. Therefore, Dick Cheney is the 44th president. Again, that's a valid argument. Now you may be wondering at this point, if validity doesn't have to have true premises, doesn't have to have a true conclusion, if the conclusion can be false, if the premises can be false, and you still have a valid argument, or vice versa, you can have true premises and a true conclusion and not a valid argument. Well, what is this validity thing anyway? What are we talking about? Well, let's take a look. Validity relates entirely to the form or basic structure of the argument. This is why philosophers and logicians often symbolize arguments with things like this, just letters and symbols, like P, arrow, Q. You read that, if P, then Q, where P stands for a sentence and Q stands for a sentence. Then P, and then you read the three dots as therefore Q. And so if you read that whole thing, it comes out if P then Q, P, therefore Q. You can represent everything that's important about the validity of an argument in terms like that without even mentioning whether P or Q are true or false. And what that amounts to is this. An argument is valid if, and only if, it is impossible for the premises to be true and for the conclusion to be false at the same time. In order to understand that, you have to take impossible pretty strictly. It's not enough for it to be something that's probably not true. It's not even enough to be something that you know is not true. That's not enough for validity. The only kind of possibility that will do for purposes of testing the validity of an argument is self-contradictory. What that means is you have to think about the case in which you imagine the premises being true and the conclusion being false, and you have to get a contradiction. You have to get something that says, in effect, the very same thing is both true and also not true. That's the kind of impossibility that we're talking about there. Here's a different way to put the definition of validity. An argument is valid if, and only if the premises are true, then the conclusion must be true. In other words, what that says is that given the truth of the premises, the conclusion is guaranteed. There's no way the conclusion can fail to be true while the premises are true. You'd probably like to know how you can check for validity. On one hand, logicians have various specialized and technical ways of testing whether an argument is valid, and ultimately they can prove it, but we won't go into those here. Instead, I'll start with a few tips. First, isolate the form. You remember the form is something like the if P then Q. Isolate that. Isolate the basic form of the argument all the way through. Then, second, try to construct a counterexample. A counterexample is a case where another argument has the same form, but you can see that the conclusion could be false even if the premises were true. And if you do succeed in coming up with a counterexample, then the original argument is not valid. Now, why? Because validity is entirely a matter of form. If they have the same form, they're either both valid or both invalid. Let's try it with one of the invalid arguments from earlier. If Obama is the president, then he received the most votes. Obama received the most votes. Therefore, Obama is the president. Now let's see. We need to figure out what the form of that is. Plainly, this goes like this. If O, then M. M. Therefore, O. That's the form. That's the basic form of that argument. Now we look for a counterexample that has the same form. Try this. If it is raining, the road is wet. The road is wet. Therefore, it is raining. Now, obviously, that argument has problems, because the road could be wet for some other reason, like a broken water main. That argument is not valid. The premises could be true, while the conclusion is still false. Since it has the same form as the previous argument, that argument is not valid either. Why? Because validity, have I said anything about this before? Validity is entirely a matter of form. So what's the use of validity? What is this idea good for? Well, because it can be determined without reference to whether the premises are true or false, having the idea gives you a powerful intellectual tool. In particular, it enables you to do two things. First, it gives you a way to tell there's something wrong with an argument even when you don't know whether the premises are true. This means you can look at something in a field that you're not familiar with, and you don't have to be completely lost. You can say, oh, somebody is offering an argument for such and such a conclusion, and I can see that the conclusion is not supported by the argument, even though I don't know anything about whether the premises are true or not. Second, if the argument is valid, it tells you where to start investigating to figure out whether to accept its conclusion. Namely, what you have to do is you have to start trying to figure out whether all the premises are true. In particular, if they're not all true, the conclusion may or may not be true, but that argument, whatever it is, does not show the conclusion is true. And second, if it's valid and all the premises are true, then the conclusion must be true as well. And of course, then the reasonable thing to do is to accept the conclusion.